Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
We'll be continuing our lesson from Sunday from our new book in the Minor Prophets, and having some discussion about that chapter that there, Hosea chapter 1 through 3. We already discussed one particular point there on sort of the chronology and the setting, which was that Hosea is not the first book chronologically in the order of the Minor Prophets. But let's go ahead and talk about that, what that means in a little bit more detail, and look at the setting in which it does occur. I'm not sure my mic is very well. Our first king that's mentioned there at the beginning of the book is Uzziah. Then we get Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and Jeroboam. Those are the kings mentioned right at the beginning of that text as the ones that Hosea's ministry took place under. One king of Israel, Jeroboam, I did think it did mention on Sunday. He is not the original Jeroboam. This is Jeroboam II, the one who was, had shared a name with probably one of the worst kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. But as far as the other four, they're all kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. And we've got a mixed bag here. Uzziah and Jotham are generally considered to be among the good kings. They had generally good policies. They were generally faithful towards the Lord as far as that goes. Whereas Ahaz was considered one of the bad kings. He strayed from the Lord, and Hezekiah is also a good king. So those are the sort of people that we are looking at. Hosea, of course, being a minister to the people who is trying to speak towards this upcoming captivity, speaking more to the northern kingdom of Israel because their captivity is much more close at hand than the one of the southern kingdom. One of the terms I think that is useful to talk about when it comes to Hosea that we've talked about in other contexts recently is that Hosea is what we would call a redeemer. He's one who buys back from a failed state or from a lesser state. The woman that he marries then is adulterous towards him, and by all rights he could put her aside, he could divorce her, he could treat her badly, but God uses his example of reconciliation, of redeeming their relationship, bringing her back into the fold, as an example of what God wants to do to the Israelite people. God's not seeking divorce or separation. He says instead he's looking for reconciliation. So one of the points I wanted to make sure we discussed that we didn't necessarily get as much time to talk about is to go back and talk about this idea that in the second verse of the first chapter, it mentions that Hosea is to take a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Okay, it's a very sort of Jerry Springer kind of situation here because we don't really, maybe more Povich, we don't know who the father is of his children, right? That's the implication. She's a loose woman, a prostitute, maybe even a ritual prostitute. She's going out and having sex with other men, so who is actually the father of the children? One of the points I wanted to talk about, get your thoughts on, is the meaning behind that in a little bit more detail. My view is that the reason why God had him do this is that he took a thing that had become commonplace, banal, taken for granted, which is idolatry, and he underlines it and emphasizes it with this, this infidelity, which would be shocking by any standards, right? Where he's intentionally marrying a woman he knows is going to sort of go out and be unfaithful to him, and names the children as if they were his own children. He acts like a father towards them while giving them names like not my children, not loved, things like that, and continues to have this sort of hot and cold relationship with her, where she is, unfaithful. So what I think is that the purpose behind this particular type of relationship was to emphasize this sort of thing that people took for granted of idolatry, with this shocking example of unfaithfulness in their personal relationship. To highlight how much people were being unfaithful to God, he intentionally told Hosea, this woman's going to cheat on you anyway, and she's unfaithful. You go ahead and marry this ritual prostitute to Baal, and then that'll be an example to people of what they're being like towards me. Did anybody have any thoughts or comments on Hosea and his marriage relationship here?
It's almost a living prophecy. It's a prophecy through Hosea's life.
Mm-hmm.
And you take those comparisons to what he's going through in this situation and how the children of God act, and it's not dissimilar. It's you can relate to it. And hopefully they can see it, the ones that he's prophesying to at that time. They'll see this comparison.
Absolutely. It's a parable brought to life.
Yeah, a parable brought to life. There's a lot of poetic verse there, but it's all real. We're talking about a real event.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as much as Hosea very eloquently and poetically describes in his prophecy what the metaphor means, he's still having to live it. Like, it's still happening to him. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But also, I think it holds true even to today. People's unfaithfulness to God, because it's, her unfaithfulness to Hosea is, what God is saying Israel is to him. Well, the same thing holds true to today. And it's we get how awful that is. We get, how in your face hurt that is.
Yeah.
And so, when you compare that to, that is my action toward God, my lack of self-control, my lack of whatever your thing is, that is, I am gomer to God in that way.
Sure.
So it's very striking, I think.
Well, it also highlights to me how much our values have shifted even over the last couple of generations. Because you think back about just even in the last 100 years or so, I'm not saying this is everybody, and I'm not saying it was as commonplace, but it was kind of accepted among certain, especially higher social circles, that a man had his wife and then he had his mistress. And now you think about that kind of stuff, and there might be celebrities and rich people who just kind of do whatever they want to do, and there's probably some less affluent people who do that too. But there isn't sort of that social undercurrent of it's not as accepted, even as unacceptable as it was at the same time. But partially you can credit, well, if a woman's getting cheated on, she can just go get a job. She can go out on her own. If she feels like that's not an arrangement she wants to be in, she can take care of herself. Some freedom's been given there. It's not like you're sort of stuck in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant, waiting for your cheating husband to come home. So there's something to be said there. But at the same time, that's almost made this that much more relevant all over again. You know, that to me, unfaithfulness means so much more when there is that sort of less of a power imbalance. You know, if a person, let's not use me as an example, but let's say a man gets married, then he cheats on his wife, well, now he just has to live with the consequences. Like, there's something real to that beyond, just the social shame and the stigma. Now his wife can just say, okay, well, I'm done with you. And, partially the Bible's to credit for that, because Paul writes about divorce from both sides, that a woman can leave her husband. And on that point, let's go to Ephesians and chapter 5. And let's talk about unfaithfulness in the context of how Paul talks about the church. Ephesians chapter 5, and starting in verse 22. Paul has spent both part of chapter 4 and into chapter 5 counseling the Ephesian church about their lack of unity and their lack of purpose in their conduct. That they are not living in a meaningful way towards God, and they need to, as he says at the beginning of this chapter, be imitators of God, and to make the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. He's counseling them to be aware of their conduct. Then we arrive at verse 22, and he starts out verse 22 like this. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, I could stop right there, and you would think that Paul was trying to tell you how to conduct yourself towards your spouse. And Paul is saying, wives, you've got to be submissive to your husbands, men, you have to love your wives. But Paul doesn't stop there. Paul in verse 32 says, this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So he was saying, okay, there is a certain paradigm that we're talking about here, a human understanding that you can grasp, where the wife respects the role of her husband, and the husband loves his wife as his own body. Give up anything for her. He wants to protect her, just like she was part of his own flesh. And then Paul says, but I'm really talking about Christ and the church. The point of what I'm trying to make through this passage is what I've been talking to you Ephesians about up to this point. Ephesus is a big pagan city. Remember when they first showed up there, there was like this book burning where they burned all their books of magic and astrology, because they were like, we're going to give up this life and now we're going to dedicate ourselves to God. And there was a riot because the silversmiths thought, we're not going to be able to sell any idols anymore because these Christians are taking over. So there's a big cultural shift going on in the church of Ephesus, where they're coming out of this pagan world into a Christian one. And he says, this is a relationship you even as pagans, former pagans, understand. That a wife and a husband have this dynamic where there's sharing of this relationship mutually, but with different aspects of the role across those two parties. And now, I want you to be faithful to Jesus just like you'd expect your wife to be faithful to you. I want you to be faithful to God just like you'd expect your husband to be to you. I want you to have this respect, but specifically, the way he says is we are the wife. We are the church. So we are to be in submission to God. So he does something a little bit subversive in saying that too by building this up. Because he starts out with, now women, you better respect your husbands, better submit to them. And men, submit to Jesus. So whatever power you thought you had, men, you're subject to somebody too. And you've got to be subject to Jesus. Submit your role and your authority and your will, whatever power you thought you were going to hold over your wife, that belongs to Jesus now. Okay? Now, you behave like Jesus, and we'll be all right. So, it's the same sort of dynamic applied to this new role that God's people have in the church versus the nation of Israel in Hosea's day. Any comments or questions on that passage? Any other relevant passages we might look at? Well, traveling back to Hosea to continue on that point, in verse 16, we see, it will come about that day, declares the Lord. Now, this is my New American Standard I'm reading from here. It will come about in that day, declares the Lord, that you will call me Ishi, and you will no longer call me Baal. Okay, they left the Aramaic terms in here, whereas my New International that I read from on Sunday translates those. You will no longer call me my master, but instead will call me, you will call me my husband and no longer call me my master. And he's using the term Baali very specifically there, because if you're hearing that, it sounds like the same name of these false gods that they've been worshiping, the Baals or the Baals, right? So he's saying, you're going to call me my husband. You're no longer going to call me my master. He's also saying you're going to recognize who's really in a relationship with you and what our relationship really ought to be like. It's as one of people who are joined in a mutual understanding of love and of the sort of marriage contract, and no longer one who is over you, subjecting you to his will, forcing you to do certain things, but instead someone for whom you have a desire to be a part of that loving marriage relationship in the ideal sense between God and his people. Any comments or questions on our passage so far? Well, one of the other things we can talk about here is we can go on to verse 5 of chapter 3 is one point I wanted to look at. And in fact, I'm going to read the entirety of chapter 3 because it is only 5 verses, and we'll start our conversation from there. Then the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the sons of Israel, even though they turn to other gods and love rages and cakes. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. Then I said to her, you shall stay with me for many days, you shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man, so I will also be towards you. For the sons of Israel will remain for many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days." So I did have a little bit of a rant on the imminency of the current end times being referenced here in our book, but there's some more important things to talk about in this text that have some relevance on our current conduct in our lives. First, let's just stop and look at the symbols that are being discussed in verse 4 for the things that Israel must remain without. First, you will not have king or prince. So the removal of this gift, this sort of allowance that God made to the Israelite people. They said, all the nations around us have kings, give us a king. And so they got Saul, and then David. And then the house of David was to continue being their king from then on. So that was the first thing that's been removed. No king or prince, nobody of the royal bloodline. Without sacrifice or sacred pillar. Now the sacrifice represents the priesthood, and the sacred pillar represents the temple itself. So the sacrifice can only be conducted by Levites, and the sacred pillar is the place where the high priest or the king would stand and read from the holy texts, from the book of the law. And so it's representing not only the people who would conduct the sacrifice properly under the law, but also the place in which it would be conducted. And then it also says, without ephod or household items. Now the ephod is representative of the Levites, which are the common, everyday workers in the temple. One of the things that Levites would do is wear the ephod, which is the sacred garment, which contains the Urim and Thummim, which are the two colored stones. We'd scribe before the Lord and ask him a question. Whichever color you bring out is a yes or a no. That is a possibility. Or also with that ephod could be referring to the ephods which were erected before the Baals, because we saw that in the book of Judges a couple times, that an ephod would be put up as an improper form of worship, so that could be something as well, and household idols are pretty self-explanatory there. Regardless, the whole point is, all of these things that you take for granted as your normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill activities here, your spiritual life here in Israel, including your king being one of God's people, those things are going to be taken away from you. They'll be taken into captivity away from that. And afterwards, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. Now you will remember, when the Israelites come back from captivity, they never successfully put another son of David on the throne. They never again crown one of his lineage until Jesus. And there is some question as to where the Ark of the Covenant was during this whole time. Were they even conducting proper temple worship if there was no Ark? Because if it had been carried away by the Babylonians or by some other group and never returned, then there's some question as to the validity of even the temple worship up until the time that Solomon's temple was, up until the time of the Herod's temple, which was long after even this, the reconstructed temple in Nehemiah's day. Am I getting that right? Nehemiah, the one who came back and rebuilt the temple. So we have a couple different eras. Okay. Any comments or questions on this sort of promise of deliverance after captivity? We see the image there of Hosea has to go and get his wife back, right? She's been kept away. He pays her ransom, her debt that she owes, whatever it is, and gets her back into his household. So this is the Redeemer part I was talking about at the beginning of class. He buys her back out of that situation and brings her back into his home. And it's also interesting to me the way God talks about Hosea's relationship with his wife. He says, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress." first. He says, you love your wife, even though she is who she is. And you knew that before you even started a relationship. What kind of a character, kind of a heart does Hosea have? That God tells him, go marry a prostitute. And he not only says yes, but he falls in love with the woman. What a tender-hearted, faithful guy. I can't help but respect that kind of attitude. He picked the right guy for the job. God knew who he was getting, because there's a lot of guys who would just, my pride, let alone my feelings, this is just going to humiliate me. You know what my friends are going to say about me? If I marry a prostitute, and then I let her keep on doing what she does? I hope nobody's uncomfortable about discussions of prostitution and sex, because it's happening a lot at this moment. I'm sorry. We discussed a little earlier the changing of the name that God said his people would call him from my master to now calling my husband. And in question 18 in this chapter, on page 22, says, what do these chapters in Hosea communicate most to you about the heart and character of God? And then question 19 follows on that very closely. It says, from what you see in these chapters, what does God especially want us to understand about the relationship he desires for his people, with his people? But I kind of accidentally answered 19 when I answered 18 because I didn't read ahead. I just answered the question. And I said, God desires a close relationship with his people. He's faithful, earnest, and devoted. And I think importantly, I think he wants the same from us. He wants that same sort of earnest devotion and commitment to him from us. Any comments or questions or comments on what you would have answered on question 18? What is Hosea, these first 3 chapters, communicate about the character of God?
There's that you mentioned, and there's also his patience. His patience with his children, the children of Israel. He loved them so much, and we saw this throughout the story when we were going over that. He loved them so much that he tolerated them. And even though they fell into idolatry, he brought them back, or he'd give them a chance to get back. There'd be some punishment involved, but ultimately his people came back, and he got them back. And it was a yo-yo kind of thing. It was, they'd come back, then they'd stray. They'd come back, then they'd stray. And more often than not fall into idolatry. But ultimately, there's going to be an ultimate, as the prophets, the minor prophets, all the prophets, leads to the solution. And that solution is Jesus.
Absolutely.
Well, when he buys her back, there's a price to be paid. And when God bought us, there was a price to be paid, his son. So, there's once again, the image, that word, that, Hosea has to take his money, his food, these things, and buy this woman back. When God buys us with his son, he pays the price for us.
A much higher price.
Much higher price.
15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. If I remember correctly, a shekel is a week's wages, or maybe a day's wages. Can't remember exactly. In the Old Testament, especially, because I think the New Testament currency is what I'm more familiar with than that. Obviously, inflation. But it's a completely different system because it's the Roman times. But you know, whatever this was stuff that,
Well, this is a common price. This is what was laid out in Leviticus, paid for. So, I mean, it was a common price.
okay,
But it was, when the price God paid,
exactly.
it was very uncommon.
An uncommon price for an uncommon cost. The sins of all humanity takes a lot to pay off, you know, absolutely.
It's almost like an outline, starting here, and then, when Jesus goes to the cross, I mean, it's like it was outlined here, but then it was,
Oh, absolutely. Oh, 100%. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Well, and that's what we've been seeing when we looked forward to Paul's writing when he says, Jesus is the church's husband. It's right there. Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Thank you. And I think that is one of the things that we can continue to see. We have seen when we were going through the story, is all these like echoes of Jesus sort of backwards and time. And the best thing we can hope for is to be an echo going forward in time and continuing to carry that message along. Had a point, but I was. Any other comments or questions? I think one of the things we can look forward to as we go through this book and the minor prophets in general is a deeper look into these parts of the history that we're looking at. As I mentioned, this is right in the middle of, let's see, I can tell you exactly, 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. That's our timeline right now. That's where we're located, is right in the middle of that sort of last book of the dynasties of the northern and southern kingdoms. And we're just going to get little really in-depth snapshots of each one of those times as we go forward, where we kind of got the aerial view when we did the story, because we were on our way to Jesus. We wanted to make sure. So now we're on the ground. We're going to look at it a little bit more in detail, and not just in the historical sense. We could go into 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Go to Judges, whatever. But look at the time when people were back from the Egyptian captivity and trying to figure out what their relationship with God is going to be like. We could do that. But what we're doing when we look at the minor prophets is looking at what was God seeing when he saw all those historical events play out. Because if we go to the Chronicles, God's involved, but there's a lot more of just history and plain telling of the facts of King so-and-so did this, and he reigned for so many days, and he died, and his son took his place. And there's sort of like, and then this battle happened, and such an army invaded. But if we look at this, it's God saw their unfaithfulness, and this was his reaction. This is what he told his prophets to say to them. So we're going to get that sort of flavor of things as we go forward. And I hope one of the things that Hosea especially can impart to us, but we can get from all of them, is all along, God was interested very intently in a relationship with his people and not just a response from them. He was not just wanting, how good are you at following directions? But he even says in some of the prophets, we'll get to a little bit later on, I hate your sacrifices. Oh, you're so good at keeping all the festivals. But it's so detestable to me when I see them because there's people starving in the street. And I don't want another sacrifice before me until you feed your neighbor. And the attitude that the people were bringing before God was unacceptable, even though they were trying to keep the proper types of worship. They were still conducting themselves in the wrong way. And there's a lot to reflect on as far as that goes. Are we being a partner to God as the church? Are we being a good wife to Jesus? Or are we just looking for a master to tell us what
Or being king of the neighbor.
to do? Or you know, there's one point in the New Testament, this just popped in my mind, so I'm probably going to misquote it, but there's something along the lines of, well, if Jesus was our owner, we would call him master, but instead we call him friend. Something or Jesus calls us friend. Is what it is. He wants us to have a relationship with him that's something other than slave and master, something deeper, meaningful than someone who merely wants us for what we can do for him, but rather what relationship we bring to one another. If God wanted robots, he would have made it. It's full of game. He made animals to do exactly what he wants, and you see how boring they are. Humans are much worse. All right. Well, that was a silly comment to end the whole class on. But if anyone has not obeyed the gospel and needs to do so, we always like to offer the opportunity that you can come forward. And we'll offer that in just a moment when we stand and sing. But as it's convenient, let's go ahead and take this time and have our announcements. Jan, any updates from Sunday